Time now for the Sunday Talk. Tonight, the politics of the angry rebel. This week, Donald Trump won enough votes to clinch the Republican presidential nomination despite months of controversial comments. And today, he came up with a new one when he said illegal immigrants were treated better than military vets. And this is a phenomenon that's happening not just in the U.S. European countries are also turning to politicians from outside the traditional political establishment. So what's behind the sudden rise of so many populist politicians? It used to be most governments were run by insiders, elites who followed the old rules. There used to be things that just couldn't be said. Now,
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
I'm self-funding my campaign, folks. Nobody controls me.
in the run-up to the American election, Trump is not the only one highlighting his outsider status.
We're going to create an economy that works for all of us, not just the 1%.
Anti-establishment Democrat Bernie Sanders has put up a real fight against the insider who was expected to have it in the bag by now. Political rebels are gaining momentum in Europe, too. In Greece and Spain, socialist governments are challenging old elites. And on the right,
la politique des Français pour les Français avec les Français.
Marine Le Pen's anti-immigration stance is a force in France. Norbert Hofer has a similar appeal in Austria. And in the UK,
a fifth column that is living within our own countries, that is utterly opposed to our values.
It's a new kind of politics where what was once considered taboo is now said openly.
They're bringing crime, they're rapists.
So where does Canada fit in the rebel revolution? Justin Trudeau has an elite pedigree, but he's been shaking things up.
The Liberal Party is removing all membership fees.
Tonight. And now we have our own reality TV star considering a run for the Conservative Party leadership. I'm joined by our panelists. Jonathan Kay is editor-in-chief at Walrus Magazine. He's joining us from Ottawa tonight. Tasha Carradine is a columnist with the National Post and iPolitics. And Darren Thorne joins us tonight. He's a human rights lawyer and political commentator. So, Darren, I really want to hear from you in just a moment, but because John's all by himself in Ottawa, John, how do you analyze all of this? Why is this happening now? There's always been populists, but why so many now?
I think one of the reasons is that we finally reached a point where a critical mass of people have decided that some of the usual dogmas they're hearing from left and right don't work. For instance, wage stagnation. There's a lot of people who just don't think global capitalism works for them anymore. Donald Trump, for instance, has railed against NAFTA. When's the last time you heard a Republican politician rail against NAFTA? It's been about 20 years. And yet, if you look at the data and you look at wage stagnation in the Rust Belt, there are people who are making the same amount of money now that they did 30 or 40 years ago. And the numbers have reached a level where people they're sick on the right of Republican mantras about free trade and just lowering taxes and that being the solution to everything. And they're sick of the conventional Democrat solutions. So they are looking for outsiders. And of course, the second big factor, especially in Europe, is that people have become terrified of terrorism and terrified of Muslims more generally. This is a sort of level of hysteria that probably you have to go back to the heyday of the Cold War to see any kind of analogy to it. And conventional politicians don't have any solution to this.
Tasha, what's your sense?
Well, I think John has named a lot of things. I think another reality in Europe is the fact that there are immigrants, migrants on their borders. Europe has a unique geographic situation, unlike North America, where they don't have much choice. People are coming there. People are massing on their borders. So that puts them not just, I think, in fear of terrorism, but in fear for their jobs, in fear for their culture, because they are experiencing a large influx of people that are different from them. And in North America, the fear of that, I think, looking at Europe, that experience is something also that politicians like Donald Trump and others can exploit. Darren?
Yeah, I mean, the societal change where in a lot of these societies, things have really changed. The neighbors that they used to have, the people they used to know, tended to be from groups that they knew and recognized. Over the last couple of generations, this has changed a lot. And you have other minor things you wouldn't think of either, like technology. If you look at the Twitterverse, for example, and social media, that is nothing if not populist. And so when you have players who understand that, you have to recognize we're not in the same social strata we were before.
How much of this is driven by fear of the other, of racism? How much populism is just racism, Darren?
I think a fair amount of it is. Certainly what we're seeing down south has very striking elements of that. Donald Trump has been out front with this. He's been very direct in what he says, and there's a real audience for it. I mean, it is possible to have populist movements that probably don't have that kind of grounding, but unfortunately what we're seeing right now, particularly from Trump, who sort of revels in it, is that it's definitely a part of it. I mean, when's the last time that we had to talk about the Ku Klux Klan in the 21st century?
Yeah, there's an element of racism in much of populism that we're seeing. There have been populist movements where you haven't seen there. It's been a class struggle, for example, think of Cuba. But if you look at what's happening in Europe, definitely there's an element of it. There's also an economic element. Like I said, there's a reality that people still, despite efforts to move out of a 2008-2009 recession, you have very high unemployment rates there. And so there is a clash, there's a tendency to scapegoat and say these people are going to come take our jobs, and plus, they are mostly Muslim. There are elements of violence also that have been experienced in Germany, for example, with immigrants, and people will point to that and say, you know, this is something we cannot tolerate, and expand it to the whole group and say that, and tar the whole group with that picture. So I think it's a combination. It's not just racist elements, but they definitely play a part of it.
So John, is it all, or is most of this driven by fear and negativity, or is some of it a good thing and sort of tossing out the bums that were in power for so long?
Well, I think if you're looking for something positive, it is tossing out a complacent political class. David Frum wrote a fantastic cover story for Atlantic magazine a couple of months ago, where he pointed out that in the case of the Republican Party, for years they were just completely tone deaf to ordinary working class people on issues like income inequality and particularly on immigration. Having lots of immigration is great if you're a Republican donor running a gigantic business and you need a lot of cheap labor. Immigration is not always so great if you're a low-wage worker without job skills and you're seeing a lot of jobs going to people who are immigrants. So you had a Republican Party whose agenda was completely driven by its donors and very little driven by the actual needs of the rank and file. The least that can be said for Trump is that he tries to ingratiate himself to ordinary voters. Now, he does it in a very vulgar way, and a lot of his policies don't make sense, but at least he's not someone who is only serving the needs of Wall Street.
I was going to say, I think it's not just Trump as well. I think the Democratic ledger, too. I think people feel that they haven't been listened to by the political elites. There is a real disconnect, and I think 8 years of the Obama administration as well, promoting lofty ideals in some case that he would like to see, but the average person in the Rust Belt that John mentioned isn't profiting from those ideals. And so they are looking and saying, you're not listening to me, Sanders speaks to me there, Hillary Clinton is to establishment, which is why I think you're still seeing in the Democratic Party that battle, even though she's going to win, that fight that Sanders is still continuing. Darren?
Yeah, much of what's been said here is certainly true. As to whether or not it's a positive change, certainly we're throwing the bums out, but we've got to be concerned with who we're replacing them with. And that's when you see the circumstance with Trump now, and it does look a little bit frightening. One of the other negative points about this, just to jump from the positive to the negative, is that unfortunately, populist movements can very quickly move to be cults of personality more than anything else, because often the people who are supporting populist movements aren't really analyzing how they're going to manage to achieve whatever the movement says it's going to achieve, regardless of whether it's on the right or on the left.
Yeah, they're looking for a strong person.
Exactly.
And that strong leader, like Trump is perceived to be strong, make America great again, for example.
Yeah, and in fact, then at that point, they're sort of relying on faith more than anything else. They put their faith in the person more than the ideals, because after all, Trump doesn't seem to have any consistent policy platform at all. It's really all about him. And so when you can very quickly move, as I said, to a cult of personality, and that can be a very, very dangerous thing.
So, John, I'll come back to you. Is Canada exempt from this sort of rebel movement, the angry rebel movement?
That's actually the argument that I made in a recent piece for Walrus, is that Canada is actually quite, I would argue that we're unique, and that I'm not sure there's another country out there that is completely bereft of this kind of angry populism as Canada. Well, some of the factors you see is, first of all, as Tasha said, we don't have a land border with Mexico. We don't have a land border with any kind of Muslim nation or any kind of a route where refugees from Muslim nations are coming. So we don't feel that lack of control that a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans feel, is that they're no longer in control of their sovereign nation. We don't have that neurosis. We also have less income inequality than some other countries. things like free health care, affordable education, sort of some of the things that are contributing to mass bankruptcy in the United States, for instance. There was another Atlantic magazine article pointed out that 47% of Americans could not scratch together $400 in case of emergency. In Canada, we don't have that level of extraordinary fragility when it comes to our money. And I think it's that sense of being completely insecure, completely at the mercy of events, that causes people to look for some kind of strong leader to impose their vision on society, because they can't deal with the way their society is currently structured.
Well, they're looking for a savior. They're looking for someone who will not just impose their vision, but a sense of order. And I think in that sense, Canada's always been tending more towards the peace, order, and good government type of model. There are pockets of people who get angry in this country. And we've seen populist movements like the Reform Party, for example. That was a populist movement, but not as angry, not to the extremes, I think, that other countries have seen, in part because of the factors John said, and also because our economy has maintained itself. Since 2008, Canada has done significantly better in many ways than other countries. If that doesn't continue, then you could see more of a populist, embracing that here.
Do you see it moving here, Darren?
Well, yeah, I would agree with much of what John says, but I would take issue to characterize it as us being completely bereft of that. As much as I'd like to think that we've come that far, we clearly haven't. You do see periodically some elements of populism in Canadian politics as well. Certainly, Rob Ford's a good example. If you go back to the Harris government, the Common Sense Revolution was nothing if not a populist movement towards this sort of notion that we had various groups taking advantage of welfare, taking advantage of affirmative action, and they were going to put a stop to that. That's very much a populist idea. So,
if I could just jump in.
Sure.
If you look at sort of, look at the Conservative Party in particular,
yes.
And you looked at their convention, there is no mainstream constituency within the Conservative Party that wants to shut off immigration. If you look at, every OECD country out there, there's at least, aside from Canada, there's at least some constituency that is anti-immigrant. There's no major NGO in Canada that's anti-immigration. There's no major political constituency in Canada. There's no journalistic constituency in Canada that's anti-immigration.
Kevin OLeary now is saying that he's considering running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He's been called by some Canada's version of Donald Trump, and he does engage in rather outlandish comments sometimes, name-calling, and calls his colleagues losers and so on. Is it a fair comparison?
No. I think, he's brash in the sense that Donald Trump is brash, and he's a reality TV star, and that's, I think, and he has got money, and that's where it ends, because his politics are very different, his policies are different. For example, he's not militaristic at all. He thinks Canada should disengage, which has prompted one MP to say, you're in the wrong party, you should be with the NDP. So I think Mr. OLeary, in style, might be populist, but again, Canadians, populists, are not as angry.
I got to wrap up in 30 seconds. John, your view on Kevin OLeary as our Trump?
It's so pathetic that he's the best we can come up with in terms of like an angry white man. I mean, he's not even that angry. I think he's Exhibit A. If he's the brashest Trump-like guy we've got, this is a pretty great country to live in, I would say.
Aaron?
I wouldn't disagree with that. And I mean, at the end of the day, we are doing quite well in this way. We can't get too complacent about it, because I think one of the things with populist movements is no one ever really sees them coming. So we do have to be careful. But are we well situated? Certainly we're well situated.
Thanks so much, Darren. Lovely to have you, and nice to see you in the box there, John. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Sasha. Good night.